folks, and welcome to our next monthly webinar series as a part of our Connected Conservation series. My name is Cass Hardy, and I'm one of the team members for our Connected Conservation Community of Practice. Thanks so much for tuning in for today's webinar. As you may know, we host a webinar at least once a month, sometimes more than once a month or so, but our general focus is to provide our community and our partners and friends with tools that enable cross-boundary conservation work and working beyond the boundaries of our park units or within our programs. So I did plug in a link into our chat box there to our Connected Conservation Toolkit, which is a resource site that has a lot of information on not only our webinar series and all the recorded webinars that we've done in the past, but it also has a lot of information on our work to date. There's a number of success stories that we've called out. There's examples of agreements. There's templates that you can utilize to do this type of work. In addition to that, we also have a full resource site focused on, or resource section rather, focused on legislative work, as well as a variety of different types of policies that you can utilize to support this type of work. So feel free to check that out. In a second, I'll plug in a secondary link that'll take you to the Network for Landscape Conservation site. So our partners can access that site. Feel free to peruse the resources on there, learn a little bit more about that nationwide initiative that not only integrates all of the federal agencies, but a lot of the nonprofits who are working on this important work as well. Without further ado, today our presenter is Sharon Farrell. She is with the One TAM initiative with Golden Gate National Parks Conservancy. But today she's going to be focusing on a newer initiative that has come about in the last few years called the California Landscape Stewardship Network. And this is an incredible initiative that is still getting off the ground, but there's a lot of exciting progress that's happened in the last year or so. So with that said, Sharon, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, and we'll take questions throughout the presentation in that question box, and then we'll open up the lines at the end. Sharon,
great.
It's all you.
Great. Can you hear me?
Yep, you sound great.
Great. Well, good morning or good afternoon to everyone who's joining. My name is Sharon Farrell, and a little bit of background before I really begin the presentation. Yes, I work for the Golden Gate National Parks Conservancy, but I began my career in this type of work, working for the National Park Service as an ecologist in the early 1990s. And I've been fortunate enough to be a part of working in stewardship, both community-based and also just more in kind of a land management context for the last 25 years. And through that work, I've worked with representatives from the Nature Conservancy, folks from New York to Chicago, Wisconsin, down in Michigan. So I've seen a lot of changes over time. And part of my framing of this conversation is I truly believe we are a part of a movement, and this movement has been actually happening for the last 20 to 25 years. And with the evolution of these large landscape stewardship and conservation efforts, I think we're really seeing further growth and evolution of that work. So for today, so Cass, I'm not able to move my slides forward. I apologize for a technical glitch. I could probably give the whole presentation with just this one graphic, but for the benefit of all of you on the phone and in the webinar.
Let's see. Can you go to the left, actually? Oops, sorry. Bring that back up again, Sharon. There you go. Perfect. Good job.
It moved. Okay. Sorry for that minor technical glitch. You always have to have something to remember a presentation by. Hopefully that will not be what you remember this presentation by. Anyway, so for today, what I'd love to be able to do is talk a little bit more around what I really see as a growing field of practice in the context of large-scale landscape restoration and stewardship, and then introduce something that I've been working on for the last 2 years, and a number of parks here in California are a part of, and that's the evolution of the California Landscape Stewardship Network. And then through that conversation, share with you an overview of the network structure, some of the goals we're working on here in California, and the priorities that we're moving forward at this point in time. So as I mentioned, I've been working in this field for quite some time, and I feel over the last probably 3 to 4 years, here in California, we're at a critical juncture. We're at a time and place where we're seeing a lot of changes. Here in the state of California, more recently with our California state parks, we have seen the evolution of what's called the transformation process. And as a part of that transformation process, which really grew out of a budget crisis that happened in 2011 and 12, there has been much more focus on partnership and working across boundaries. And then similarly in the national parks, the movement around scaling up and the recognition that working across boundaries has much greater benefit ecologically, our weaves, our trails, our creeks, even our volunteer and visitor base. They don't know the jurisdictional boundaries that often define those lands that we work with on. And that's happening not just in national state parks, that's happening in the Forest Service. There was recently an inventory of all of the community stewardship efforts that were happening here in the state of California. And land trusts and others who have spent their time really acquiring land are now looking to what does long-term stewardship look like. And there really hasn't been a playbook, if you will. For those of you working in this field and having to undertake your work at a landscape scale, when we started, for example, our WANTAM initiative, we began looking around the state of California to see who else is doing this work and what can we learn from them. We went all the way up to Tahoe and looked at the brand. How do you brand this new concept of working across landscapes? How do you be able to create a language such that the public understands? We don't lose our agency identities, but we see what that collective vision is, the ability to scale up larger than ourselves. We then traveled up to North Coast Redwoods, and we looked at compliance, and we looked at planning across boundaries. We went to Southern California and talked about how do we share data, all these things that in essence help operationalize the work that we're actually being tasked to do as we're reaching this critical juncture to be able to really look at efficiencies and put into practice as a part of our day-to-day work, this notion of working across landscapes. And what we found in those conversations was there were some common challenges that we all, as we were moving these efforts forward, faced. We all were struggling, for example, with how do you share data across state, county, municipality, federal, jurisdictions when you're looking at regional assessments, whether they be ecological or visitor use assessments. We also recognize that it's a challenge permitting across jurisdictions if you're looking to improve creek habitat and that creek travels through 3 different jurisdictions. So with that, we decided we would form a network of networks. It was basically a peer exchange network, and we call it the California Landscape Stewardship Network. And the premise is to be able to look at advancing solutions to shared barriers and challenges so that we can better operationalize the work that we're doing across landscapes. And those blobs that you see on the map really represent just an inventory, as we understand it, of a number of these areas within California that are operating at this scale, that have basically created either formally or informally landscape scale approaches across jurisdictional boundaries. The ones in the lighter green are the ones that are actively involved in the network. They range from the work that's branded as Redwoods Rising, which is the national and state parks in that region working jointly with Save the Redwoods League, all the way down to the larger area, which you see is the Southern Sierra Conservation Collaborative. And then you keep going south, we've got the Orange Coast Collaborative. So these are collaboratives and networks that are already working to scale beyond their jurisdictional boundaries to accomplish shared goals that we are trying to create a vessel, if you will, where we can facilitate exchange and build solutions to problems that we're all sharing in the state of California. And that focus really is on developing partnership skills. It's advancing the practice here in California, and it's recognizing that the pace and scale of the challenges that we're facing, basically we need to develop solutions that not only meet that, but even exceed that. So when we first got together, and this was in June of 2016, we agreed that what we felt would be helpful would be to convene once a year, and that what we needed was funding to support those convenings. And the Conservancy who I work for, the Golden Gate National Parks Conservancy, was able to secure a grant through the S.D. Bechtel Foundation that provided three things: food, travel, and lodging, basically to facilitate these convenings. And the convenings, the attendees were from those 6 initial networks, and I mentioned a couple, the Redwood Rising. We also have Tahoe Basin. Here in the Bay Area, we have the Peninsula Working Group, which is based out of San Mateo. We also have in Santa Cruz, the Santa Cruz Mountain Stewardship Network. And we decided to put together a suite of priorities that we felt crossed all of our boundaries. And those were, as listed here on this slide, to look at how we begin to advance policies and increase funding. And I'll talk more about this, because funding for capital projects, funding for acquisition is much easier to gain than funding for stewardship. And we can talk a little bit more about our approach to that. And then we also wanted to identify system solutions to both data sharing, to communication and branding. And those are efforts that we're currently advancing, and I can speak to those, as well as developing a communication strategy. Coming from the nonprofit community, we have found that being able to brand this work and to bring it into the public domain in a way that people can understand it and really gain appreciation for it, as well as for those of us working in the field to basically see ourselves within that brand, that's something that we're really wanting to be able to put forward. And we're doing that in coordination on a national scale with the Network for Landscape Conservation, and then on the local scale with more of these more regional networks. I think in short, we're also looking to simplify the language we're using. And so this is a way in which we describe what landscape stewardship is. And in short, it really is, on the most simplest level, how we work together across boundaries to ultimately care for, and that's really through that lens of stewardship, the places that many of us love and depend upon, not only ecologically, but for ecosystem services and just for the sheer beauty, recreational experiences, and that how we continue to renew and sustain these. And so the language we're using is tiered. The language we're using, we're hoping to speak to the broader public. At the same time, we have language that is more technical that really speaks to our peers within the network itself. How we're structured is we don't have any paid staff. We have a steering committee, and that steering committee is made up of representatives from each of the large networks in the state who are actively participating in this time. And then we have working groups, and those working groups are designed to look at developing solutions to the priorities and the challenges that we had identified as important in our first few years of work. Within each working group, you don't have to necessarily be a part of a large landscape network to participate. And I'll give you an example for our funding and legislation, which I'll talk more about. Not only does it have representation from those folks working at the scale, but also practitioners and experts that are working both in policy, working for regional parks that may be adjacent to these areas, working with foundations, such that we're developing a cohort, if you will, of individuals that can advance solutions to the challenges that we've identified. We see our membership primarily being those who are working in this field in the state of California, but there are many others that we describe as affiliates. Here in California, we have what used to be the LCCs that are sadly not funded at the level that they should be. We have what we call the California Landscape Conservation Partnership, which that's evolved into. We have also the California Biodiversity Council. We have many other environmentally oriented, stewardship oriented groups who we also have affiliations with, and that we're working to develop a common vision and look at where we have our shared messaging and our separate messaging, such that, for example, when there's a transition here in our own administration, which will be happening soon, that we can talk about the messages of stewardship, the messages of working across this scale, both at the political level, but also at the local level. And then we also connected to, as I mentioned, the larger work that's happening on a national scale and to work that's happening in other states. And that's what I describe as the larger movement. So how do we do this? We are a small but mighty few right now. We convene, as I said, once a year, and after our first convening in 2017, we decided that we would convene twice a year. And between those convenings, we basically, each working group has tasks that come directly from the convening that we advance and bring to the next convening. We also have a charter that we've developed that really describes the whole structure and function of the network and our governance. And this is just a picture of a few representatives from around the state that came to our convening in Asilomar. We also have what we call collaborative conversations. One of the things that came out of working with a number of the networks around the state was this strong interest to be able to have the opportunity to take a concept that's a regional need and to bring together individuals from various disciplines, backgrounds, organizations, and agencies to learn and share from each other. And two that I'll reference right now. One was looking at the issues of traffic, resource protection, and transportation issues in the Tahoe Basin region. This is a big issue. Here in Golden Gate, Muir Woods has had to grapple with this for quite some time, has come up with some very innovative practices around looking at creating shuttles and also a reservation system. And then south of us, there are Point Lobos and a number of other regions have similar issues. So we convened all of those groups together, sharing what practices the National Park Service, especially here at Golden Gate, had learned and was piloting, and all of the rationale and the environmental planning around that. And then the other groups were able to share where they currently stood in that work and also what they were hoping to gain, and then created a small network amongst them just to be able to exchange future information. Similarly, many of us grapple with how we define and describe the impacts of stewardship. Many folks sadly look at stewardship just as deferred maintenance or just as something that's kind of an operationalized way to maintain our work. We believe there are many dimensions to stewardship, and I can describe those more. And we've facilitated 3 storytelling workshops around the state of California to not only capture stories of stewardship, but also be able to define in quantitative and qualitative terms impacts of stewardship, such that they can be used by our partners and network members to be able to justify funding sources and advance conversations about the scale and strength of stewardship work. A little bit just diving deeper under the hood a little, the working groups. This one is our funding and legislation one. As I mentioned, it is made up of representatives from these landscape scale networks and collaboratives, and also others who have vested interest and expertise in this area. And they work across the state tracking legislation and grant opportunities specifically around stewardship, and such that they then can communicate across the state about what is coming up, whether it's Proposition 68 in the state or other funding sources. And then when the grant guidelines come out, how do we have a shared voice, but also who's commenting on which, how can we support each other's comments. And it's really been, I think, just for the first year we've been doing this, a great way to scale our work and to be able to attract the interest of audiences that hadn't perhaps thought as closely about the value of this kind of work and the importance of stewardship overall. We're also providing educational opportunities to our network members to help support them in their fundraising and policy development work, and also looking to how we communicate more succinctly and with a shared voice across the state with funders and policymakers. And I recognize that a lot of this audience is, your federal employees. And so within the network, what we do is, because so many of the regional collaboratives have nonprofit partners, some of us are able then to talk with funders in a different way that the federal employee could. So we define our work and we share our work according to what falls within our own individual policies and regulations. But through that effort, we're able to take the technical guidance from, for example, from a Park Service superintendent or a participant, and then through the nonprofit way of being able to then communicate either through those that have advocacy voices like the League to Save Lake Tahoe, or for those of us that work around communication and community building. We then look at what strengths do each of us bring to being able to mobilize the solutions that we've identified. One thing to draw your attention to is one of the biggest things that came up in our first year as we talked about funding and legislation was that it is very difficult for this type of work to fund capacity building and support. Many networks rely upon having the support of a coordinator or partial support of someone who can help with administration, with serving as the backbone, with being able to advance the work of that specific network or collaborative. And it's one of the hardest things to fund, not only in the grants world, government grants, but also in the foundation world. And recognizing that, and also recognizing that there have been successful areas around the country that have been able to harness this type of funding for the value that capacity building provides. We've undertaken a case study in the last year where we've interviewed approximately 35 individuals. We hired a social scientist to do this, interviews from foundations to policymakers to leaders in this field, executive directors, to really assess kind of who has been successful, how have they been successful, what helped them become successful in this area, and then also what are some of the challenges we face and what are some of the solutions that we believe that we want to bring to the attention of funders and policymakers around this concept of funding capacity for landscape scale work. So that's coming out most likely in the middle of November, at the end of the month, definitely, and so I can make sure that Cass gets a copy of that and can circulate it. For the funding and legislation group, one of the big things that they're working on is they're working on developing definitions that they can put into policy and statutes around landscape scale stewardship. They're also looking to how to perhaps create granting categories that are different than your typical capital-based efforts that are 3-year grants or your acquisition-based granting sources, and see if there's a way we can come up with a new way of looking at stewardship. And while I can't say what that looks like yet, there's been conversations that have already been starting with some of the state funders about how do we look to the long term? How do we look at what some of the impact stewardship has and what it needs to advance, and other different funding opportunities and whole different funding business plan structures that we might want to embark upon. And that conversation is not just with state grant makers, it's also with private philanthropists. And so this is something that we're hoping that we can begin to harness and identify some of these new opportunities. We're also wanting to develop impact statements around what stewardship can and does provide on the landscape, and outcomes that then can be used within this field that, again, help strengthen a lot of our grant writing and our fundraising around this work. And also just introducing perhaps new policies and legislation around stewardship-based work for the future. We've seen a lot of changes in the last 30 years around how policy and funding is actually supporting different aspects of our work, from everything around climate change, so and now looking at forest health and forest resiliency. So how do we capture some of those dimensions as we look at funding long-term stewardship? One of the next working groups that I actually sit with is what we call our stewardship framework. When we began our work early on, we were very struck by stewardship is a hard term to define. It has academic definitions. It has different definitions with different agencies, and many people think about it in different terms. And so amongst ourselves, we actually didn't have a collective way in which we express stewardship. We also began thinking about how do we position this conversation such that we can inspire people to join or use it as a way to help build a common culture. And this graphic, I will share that I'm originally not from this country. So this was my way of trying to organize my understanding of the conservation eras and movements of this country in a way that really represents where I think we are today. which is what I describe as the landscape scale stewardship movement. I've seen this already developing in Europe and Scandinavia, and it's this blend of looking at the ecological systems and the management approach we need for these ecological systems and the role of people in supporting that. And when we have conversations amongst ourselves within the network, we talk a lot about the fact that previously it's been, we have relied upon many others to help conserve the lands we now have the privilege to manage. And they were perhaps very few individuals, many philanthropists, a lot of activists, but really stewardship is the way in which we can democratize our work. It's the way that we create opportunity for people to engage on all levels, whether you be a high school student, a practitioner, a farmer. And this movement, as I began my talk with, is something that began a number of years ago. And I think we're just now, really getting we're really becoming a part of the heart of it. And it takes us back, it harkens back to, previous times, when this land was managed by, First Nations peoples. And it's much more reflective, its practices are much more reflective of Indigenous stewardship. So in some ways, while this is a line, it could actually be a circle. And we use this just to talk about kind of the evolution of the way in which we've cared for our landscapes and where we believe we currently sit. And this slide I use oftentimes when I'm talking to folks about stewardship and conservation. And I work primarily in Marin County. And in Marin County, most of our lands, from our national parks to our water districts to our state parks, have been really saved over the last 100 years, and with a large number of those lands in the last 50 years. And we used to believe, as this fence shows, that all we needed to do was save the land. And this is, I think, the changing dialogue we now see. We now understand that that's different, and there is a level of active management. But I think our level of understanding as practitioners, as scientists, as folks who are leading these larger efforts isn't necessarily the same understanding of the broader public, and again, many of our politicians and our funders. And so how do we, as I was describing within the policy and legislation group, how do we begin to provide the muscle on the bone, if you will, of that changing narrative of what was once believed that it was really the bucks and acres approach, and that was where we basically were going to be able to create resilient and protected landscapes, to now a place that we know that there needs to be different levels depending upon the need of active management based upon all the changes that have happened and the changes we see before us, to be able to ensure that long-term care. And to illustrate that, this particular working group that's been thinking a lot about communication, we decided to think about the words that really come to mind when we think about landscape stewardship. And I don't have enough time to share all of this right now, but we actually took this and we compared it back to ways in which stewardship has been defined through different lenses, through the more theological lens, through the business lens, through, if you would have looked at a word cloud like this 20 years ago when it looked at environmental stewardship. And that language has really changed. That language really reflects not only the land and the landscape and the ecological pieces, but it talks also about sense of place and people, relevancy. And so I think that as we move forward in this work, we really believe that marriage of the ecological and the social dimensions is so important if we want to have this work be relevant and we want to have this work be hopeful. And so instead, when folks hear us talk about climate change, you can go straight to that more the sky is falling concept versus how do I participate? How do I engage? How do I engage at a landscape scale? How do I make a change on my working land adjacent to a national park, for example, that moves us towards a bigger vision? So this was just a way I use sometimes just to show the multidimensionality of what we describe as landscape stewardship through just the illustration of some of these words. And so what do we do with all this? And what we're working on right now is creating a series of case statements about why investing in stewardship, what are the true impacts of stewardship? Currently, we've been looking through our storytelling workshops and through a lot of research at 5 key areas of impact that we're currently looking to develop both quantifiable and qualitative ways of measuring. They are probably the most familiar you might think of are the ecological impacts, and they are very multidimensional. They're around process, they're around function, they're around specifically maybe a species. And then there's the social side, that sense of place, that you know, the mental health, the physical health. There's many dimensions of impacts of stewardship. The cultural side, there's many cultural changes and cultural practices that are linked to stewardship. Economic, you know, whether you're looking at ecosystem services, whether you're looking at workforce development, and then there's also the governance impacts. And so through all of this work that we're doing around the state, what we hope to do is put together a paper. And again, just all of this information we just hope to put right back out into the broader community of practitioners, of things that might resonate, can be used, hopefully, to strengthen your own landscape stewardship work. And then lastly, what we're working on currently is the last 2 elements is developing a strategic communications plan that we hope to work on a statewide level with, and then working with a marketing company and probably some pollsters to brand and scale this work such that as we start talking more about it, that we link it to other movements, that we make it such that it's a part of common conversation, if you will, at least here in the Bay Area where I work. There's a lot more recognition and understanding about, you know, people's roles as stewards on our land. And we may use different words to describe it, but the general premise and the opportunity and the pathways to participate are emerging around all the 9 counties of our region and have been for some time. So this is how to take things we've learned as well as what's learned in the North Coast Redwoods, where they're working with indigenous communities and maybe more rural communities, again, and then down into LA, where the LA River, Santa Monica Mountains, they're working with more urban communities also. You know, how do we begin to put these pieces together such that we have something that we can begin to scale, share common language, build common culture, and ultimately advance this work in a way that it resonates not only for those who are elected officials and funders, but for the larger community here in California. To give you an idea, just simple draft messages that we're currently working on, and they may just seem to many of you, of course, commonplace, but again, how do we take the messaging of our work and have it such that it's easily digestible? We believe there's an urgent need to develop a new approach. I spoke a little bit about that. It's not just the saving of land, it's the more active stewardship of land, and what does that mean, and the impacts that that has, and the connections of community, and the democratizing of those opportunities. The actions that we're taking, they're based upon data and science. And I think the last 2 for me are really important. I think sometimes we might forget that it's really important to identify that there's a role for everyone in this work, and really being very clear about what those roles are. And really, lastly, is that invitation and identifying ways in which people can participate. Again, I apologize for talking about so much in a short period of time, but I wanted just to illustrate some of the pieces of our work. And this one is our 3rd working group, which is really around permitting and compliance. And this one has a very different focus than the ones I've just shared. This one was born out of the recognition that we believe that we need to increase the efficiencies within how we regulate beneficial restoration opportunities. And what we identified were really there were 3 buckets that we feel that we need to be able to help affect change around. And there are already some incredible leaders working in 2 of the buckets. Those are the programmatic buckets, and I've identified areas where programmatically things are already underway or things have already happened to help increase efficiencies in programmatic permitting and compliance. There's the legislative piece where we're actually putting into policy ways to increase efficiencies. But the one that we feel hasn't really been addressed is what we call the cultural risk paradigm. And that is the one where it really comes down to how we look at action. especially how we look at beneficial restoration action and how we look at action across landscapes. And if you ask many of our colleagues who are working in this area and how they talk to their colleagues who are in regulating organizations and agencies, action is often seen as risk. And it's not seen as inaction equals risk. It's more action at scale equals risk. And how do we shift that paradigm? How do we shift more to action, especially beneficial restoration action at scale, is an imperative. If we look at what's happening within the forest systems, within our state, if we look at, many of the larger wetland systems, incremental action at a scale of 1 to 5 acres, while is good, we're arguing that if we're celebrating and requiring this practice of working across landscapes, we need to change some of the systems that we work within to be able to meet that goal. We can't work with systems which are working either at a very, very slow pace to ensure that we can get all of the necessary paperwork and permitting to work with the 10,000 acre forest system or whatever that may be, that we need to somehow shift our perspective and look at it through the lens that it's our priority to look at beneficial restoration as an imperative, something that should be supported, and change some of the systems. And so the things that we're working on with this particular working group is we're identifying efforts underway around the state of California and nationally where there have been paradigm shifts, where there have been new approaches, not to decrease the importance and value of those regulations, but to look at new ways of employing them such that the type of work that we're doing across landscapes is much easier to achieve as appropriate. We're also looking at, do we need to come up with a whole new social impact paradigm around just the way we're structured? Should there potentially be, hypothetically, 2 different approaches, one for beneficial restoration and one for other actions as far as environmental review? And while I can't say that we have solutions, we're engaging in conversations with folks at multiple scales to think about, again, if our challenge and our new way of doing things is across landscapes, how do we set up the systems such that they currently support or future support as being successful in this work? And then just lastly, before I go to questions, we also have a working group on data sharing. And that group is really looking at how do you share geospatial data across boundaries? How do you create databases such that we are mindful of all of the laws and policies and practices around data protection and data privacy, but allow for us to be able to look not only at our individual data sets, but be able to see the regional impact of our data and what our data is telling us, whether we're looking at invasive species across the entire state of California and looking at priorities within network and collaboration areas, whether we're looking at bat inventories across 7 jurisdictions, how we can represent those on a regional level as well as on a local level. So employing practices as far as creating GIS enterprises or looking at GIS online, cloud-based ways of not only hosting our data, but then also ways to push that data back to individual agencies in a way that their data management and their data policies allow for. We're partnering with CalFlora, which is has a weed management database within their structure to be able to develop ways in which you can look at regional data sets, at the same time look at your own individual data sets. And the reporting is actually in the format of each of the respective agencies' needs, and attribute tables correlate to their current practices. So it's been a journey, I'll be honest. We are trying to, again, fill a niche we believe that it's important to think about if we're operationalizing this practice. It's how do you actually make it happen? How do you address some of the barriers we all face and seek larger solutions, whether it's around language, understanding, funding structures, data, and we're going into our first retreat this next month and our 5th convening, and we're hoping to be able to further define what our role is going to be moving forward and open our opportunities for sharing across all of the boundaries of anyone who's interested in participating. So I'll stop there. And that was a lot, I understand. So please, if you have any questions, I'd love to entertain them, or just any general responses.
Great, thank you so much, Sharon. Very inspiring presentation. Again, folks, if you have questions, feel free to go ahead and plug them in that question box. I'm also going to plug in the direct link to where you can find out more about this initiative into the chat box. You'll see that come live in a second. And the California Landscape Stewardship Network has pages within, or content within, the Network for Landscape Conservation site. So the National Park Service also has some pages within that site as well. So feel free to wander around there if you've never been on their site. A lot of great resources and information. I'm also going to simultaneously, while we're waiting for some questions, open up all the lines so folks can ask questions aloud. If you are in a busy spot, feel free to just go ahead and mute yourself, and we won't keep your line unmuted. Let's see here. We do have a couple questions in our question box already, Sharon, so while I'm unmuting, I'll go ahead and ask the first one aloud. Does the network work on coastal and marine connectivity issues as well as terrestrial ones?
That's a great question. We're actually, we've asked ourselves that same question. In part, we started with the terrestrial landscape. And there are collaborations that work more on marine landscapes. So we've talked about, should we partner more with NOAA or other groups who are already doing that? We haven't fully decided, to be honest with you. It's just something that we recognize as a need, and we're trying to see if there are the groups that are already doing it that make sense for us to have greater connection to, or is that also an unmet need? Some of the practices of what we're currently doing would apply directly to marine systems, but we haven't deliberately gone beyond the terrestrial landscapes.
Great. And once again, I have opened up the line, so if you would like to mute your line, if you're not going to ask a question aloud, feel free to do that. But just know that all the other lines have opened up. A second question in our question box here: have similar models been established elsewhere in the country?
That's a good question too. There are networks of networks as far as peer exchange networks and other disciplines. I don't know of, I mean, the Network for Landscape Conservation has a peer exchange program that they piloted almost a year and a half ago, where they were looking in the Rocky Mountains in our region and then in the New England forests. But I'm not aware of other states, and Cass, you might be more aware than I am, that actually are looking at this model with this specific area of interest.
Yeah, Sharon, I would say that your model is definitely unique, looking at a statewide system, at least in a formal perspective. I think there's some informal networks that have started for statewide. The two other peer exchange, though, groups that the Network for Landscape Conservation work with right now are the Great Northern Landscape Conservation Cooperative, as well as the Regional Conservation Partnership Network. And similar to how Sharon described it, essentially the Network for Landscape Conservation is playing an observer role on each of these peer exchange networks, as well as somewhat of like a liaison or advisor from the national perspective of what's going on in this realm of work across the nation, and identifying best practices that might assist the peer exchanges. And you can learn more about all three of the networks, including the California Landscape Stewardship Network, on that link that I plugged into the chat. Other questions for Sharon? Again, the lines are open. If you'd like to speak up, feel free to.
Hi, Sharon. This is Laura Rosell from the San Francisco Regional Office here at the National Park Service.
Hi, Laura.
And I wonder if you are aware of the new Department of Interior Unified Region permitting groups that we have as of a couple of weeks ago, where we now get into a room with all the other bureaus at DOI to talk about, hey, how could we arrange permitting so that it works better across DOI agencies?
I'm not, and I would love to learn more. I really would.
Okay.
If you wouldn't mind emailing my email just with your contact information, I would love to follow up with you.
I will do that, because it's not just that I want you to know about it, but obviously I want some of the things that you have done and learned and et cetera. We want to get that information to these new groups. So thank you.
Laura, this is Kath. I would love to know more about that too, and perhaps we could do a webinar on that. It's a fascinating topic that I was telling Sharon prior to this, the webinar today, that I think it's something that a lot of people are scared to work on almost, or to think about, because it can be so complicated, or just roadblock after roadblock, it seems. So I'd love to learn more too. Maybe you can send it on to me and I can share it with the entire group. Yes.
And we have a couple of white papers, one we've written, which I can send you, Laura, and another one that will be used to consolidate information.
That would be terrific. Thank you.
And Sharon, we have another question in our box here. How does traditional ecological knowledge apply to, or is used to inform actions and policies with a group like this?
Great question. Thank you for that. A number of the networks we're working with around the state have tribal representation, from the Santa Cruz network, and then the growing network that's happening in the North Coast. Redwoods have growing relationships. And so I wouldn't say that we're looking to create any policy around it, as more as we use it as a forum and opportunity to share information. So who, for example, might be working with local tribes? How have you been successful? You know, what are ways in which you've found to develop meaningful relationships? What kinds of practices have you been able to integrate? We were just, yesterday I was actually out with a number of representatives, not from California, but from Chile, from Patagonia region and from the Santiago region. And we were down in San Mateo County, right next to Santa Cruz, at an area that a open space district has created a conservation easement with a local tribe to reduce what the open space district can do as far as future development, but to allow for increased opportunities of engagement and practices by the local tribe. And so there's a number of innovative tools as well as just general practices. And within the collection of those stories of stewardship I was sharing, we had tribal representatives share their stories of stewardship with us and talked about impacts as they see stewardship brings to their own communities and stewardship on the landscape. So again, while it's not an area of focus around policy, it's really an opportunity for us just to build our own awareness and understanding and look for ways to integrate.
Great, thanks, Sharon. Other questions from the group? You know, Sharon, I'll ask one that kind of always stands out to me, being a little involved in this group over the last couple of years. I really think the collaborative conversations that you all have been hosting are not only really inspiring, but I think that they are an opportunity for a lot of other networks that are within connected conservation or the like to really learn from. I mean, I feel like it's practitioners actually on the ground doing the work, learning from one another, and having that sort of focused conversation or dialogue around a specific topic is really impressive. Can you talk a little bit about how you all came up with that and how that's funded, and some of the major benefits that you've seen come from those collaborative conversations?
Sure. I would love to say that it came from us really contemplating a whole theory of practice. It came from, you know, an observation and just looking at other disciplines. To your point, Cass, creating opportunity where people can come together at varying levels around a key topic area or a suite of topics, and allowing for having meaningful exchange and focused exchange we've seen as one of the best ways just to build broader understanding and connect people who might not normally work together to each other, such that they have created, in essence, a network for themselves around that particular topic area. So with that being a guiding premise, what we've done is within our networks, we've asked, what are some of the key topics that you either grapple with or that you see emerging in our work that we should either look for leaders in this area or look for folks that can speak a lot to lessons learned, and pick certain topics that we will then structure conversations and figure out the right geography for that conversation. So for example, in the next year or so, the topic areas that were chosen were around early detection, rapid response. The state of California's state parks are looking at this as a primary initiative area to really expand their 5 pilot programs, and many of them work jointly with national parks. So this might be an area to have greater connection where we talk about not only the policies and procedures, but actually what does it mean to employ it at a landscape scale across multiple jurisdictions? How do you then prioritize, and can you combine or not combine, or how do you leverage funds such that you can advance treatment work as far as priorities, even if you have different guidelines around the way you might treat? So we've continued to, there's been a strong focus to continue our stories of stewardship. We've done 3, as I mentioned. Now we're going to go down to Southern California and do 1 in San Diego. And we're inviting folks like, members of the military who are stewarding lands, to BLM, to other, to nonprofits, resource conservation districts, and bringing them together to talk about the various practices of stewardship. We also have been asked if we would do another one on the issues of traffic and the balance between visitor use and resource protection. And again, I don't profess to be an expert in any of these areas. It's bringing together people that can speak to it. The last 2 that we've been asked if we would consider, one is on wildlife and wildlife management with sustainable recreation. That's another area of growing interest, especially in the Tahoe Basin and in a number of other national park regions that we've been speaking to. And then the last one that we've spoken about as far as undertaking is one really around partnership. And how do you measure the impact of partnership above and beyond what it is you physically do on the ground? It's like, what can partnership yield? I'll give you an example in the work that I'm currently doing. We've identified through a survey of more than 80 staff that participate in our work, that over 75% of them have identified an improvement in their personal job satisfaction through that. And so what are some metrics that we can begin to look at? So those are some of the ideas that we're looking at in relationship to these collaborative conversations. We try to keep them to about 30 to 40 people. The way we fund it and what we provide is we typically, for those folks we're asking to give some kind of presentation or have an active role, we give a small stipend to. We want for everyone who's interested to participate in that region. So sometimes we're able to offer travel money too, and we pay for the facility, and usually it's lunch or something along those lines within the guidelines of what I know now with many federal government guidelines, you can only accept so many different things. But many of the participants are able to join us for lunch, and so we created a relaxed environment as well as a very focused work environment. The funding for these comes from the same grant I mentioned. It was the food, transportation, and place to be. And they aren't that expensive, to be honest. The one we just did here in Real Woods, I think we brought in, well, we facilitate having almost 30 people participate, was probably less than $1,500 for everything. Now, we have done some that are a little bit more expensive, depending upon the region and the needs of the participants. But we feel it's just a great way to introduce concepts, discussions. Sometimes we bring in researchers. The stories of stewardship, we've brought in a professional storyteller who's helping, and someone who actually uses stories to help create branding and movement building. So we paid for that. So did that answer your question, Cass?
Yeah, absolutely.
And you probably wonder, how do we advertise them? So we have a newsletter within the network. So we'll advertise them through that, or we'll actually reach out if we're coming to a local area, and then just let folks know who we know of who've expressed interest when we're coming into that area. And we did one on permitting and compliance too. We did one with Sustainable Conservation, Resources Law, Conservation Strategies Group to talk about just permitting in a programmatic and legislative context.
Great, thanks so much, Sharon. We have time for maybe one more question if anyone has it, and if not, that's okay too. But again, the lines are open. Okay, well, Sharon, thank you so much on behalf of the National Park Service and our Connected Conservation Community of Practice for presenting. Great presentation today. We'll be adding this presentation to our recorded webinar series, both available internally on our resource toolkit as well as externally on the Network for Landscape Conservation site shortly after the presentation today. So watch for those there. In addition to that, just a take note, we have 2 webinars in November. November 7th, we'll be focusing on highways and wildlife crossings with the Western Transportation Institute. November 14th, we'll be focusing on seascapes and marine connectivity with the University of California. We'll be sending out calendar invites for each of those, so you can watch for those. You can also pre-register for those webinars on our internal site as well as the external page on the Network for Landscape Conservation site too. Thanks again for joining in today, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, Cass.